The project that we're going to be working on is the Pear project. The Pear project is something that when I worked with the Florence Academy, that we did in between painting in grisaille, so making cast paintings, and then expanding into a kind of limited palette and dealing with color as opposed to simply dealing with value. So the Pear, being such a kind of humble and kind of simplified subject, helps us to actually focus on the concepts that we want to focus on without having all of the maybe complicated specificity of structure that, say, a portrait has, right? Right. So the palette that I sent out to you is actually a little bit of an expanded palette from the one that I normally use. I usually just have black, vermilion, maybe alizarin crimson, yellow, brown, and white, but I've added an ultramarine blue to that. The reason being, of course, if you want to get like a certain degree of kind of greenness, yellow and black might not get you all the way there. Since I've kind of chosen a subject that kind of needs to have that kind of particular chroma, that intensity of chroma in that kind of green color range, this is why I've kind of chosen to add ultramarine blue to the palette. Which really is something interesting to just take home with you anyway, is that your palette is so much just a practical tool. I think very often we kind of fall in love with colors and put them on the palette, we kind of shoehorn them in, trying to find a way to integrate them into our process when maybe the subject matter that we're painting doesn't necessarily require it. The other colors that I have, of course, Old Holland's yellow-brown, the Vermilion Extra, also from Old Holland, the alizarin crimson, also from Old Holland, and an ivory black and flake white that are made by Williamsburg Oil Colors. All of these are really chosen just because they are representative of primaries in a sense, and also like when you have a palette that is relatively simple, it's a little bit easier to achieve a sense of color harmony with it. When we have like a super expanded palette, I think that's the challenge that you would face as an artist or as a student, is that you really have a lot more balls up in the air when you're juggling all those colors. And achieving a sense of harmony is going to be a little bit more challenging the more those you kind of add to your palette. The brushes that I'm going to be using, really what I just normally recommend to students to use anyway. Mostly soft synthetic brushes, maybe a couple of bristle brushes thrown in just to kind of scrub in some paint. I've made a drawing of a pear and I've gone like full on into value with that. This is a part of a tutorial that I'm going to be releasing actually at the beginning of next month. So there's really a full deep dive on proportion, construction, and value, and all those things. And that's really what this drawing is a part of. One more thing I did want to cover before we kind of go into the actual work of this is maybe some of the concepts that we need to take with us into this, right? The basic idea that we're focusing on is the HVC, right? So hue, value, chroma. The pear itself obviously has a local color, meaning that the surface of it is a particular color, right? A local color that is kind of yellow-green. That being said, if you just painted one yellow-green color value onto the pear, you would in no way approach the actual color effect that pear is giving when we're looking at it. So we need to look at all the kind of permutations of hue, value, and chroma that are taking place within this subject. Like I said, it makes a really nice kind of succinct, simple version of form that we can work on these very complex problems with. So while I'm mixing on my palette, I'm first thinking about the hue. So what color is it? Is it the kind of beigey looking background? Is it the kind of yellow-green of the light shape of the pear? Or is it the kind of darker yellow-brown that is in the shadow of the pear? Then I'm thinking of the value of that. So is it light? Is it dark? What zone am I kind of painting that into? And then what is the chroma? What is the intensity of color? And as I start this out, you're going to see that I kind of take the same approach to color as I do with my drawing, where I try to go really from the most simple expression of something into a much more complex expression. So let's start out and just get maybe an average color value for the shadows. So I'm going to start out with a really kind of moderate green that's relatively dark. I'm going to take an edge off of that with some of my vermilion, just because usually all of your colors, in a way, you can think about as like a form of gray, right? So always we're kind of taking orange and balancing it with blue, with black, which is another kind of like softened version of blue. You know, there's very few times that you would ever like take a pure pigment like this and kind of put it onto your canvas. Oil painting usually just doesn't work like that. So we're always starting out with that idea of complement. So I created a green and I softened it with a bit of red. Also, in this time, you want to have like as many of these little kind of tissues around as you possibly can. Always kind of cleaning your brush with them in between kind of the mixtures that you make. I just find that it's something that easily your brushes get kind of caked up with paint, and it becomes a practical problem for your process. Now I'm going to keep going and probably soften that even a little bit more with vermilion, because I think actually, in a way, the shadow is actually, in fact, not very green. I say this because what you have within the light shape, now I'm looking at the pear, I have an image of it next to me, I know you guys can't see it, but what is present within the light shape is, as I said before, like a very yellowish green. The thing that you should understand about color as it transitions into shadow is that each individual step is a change in hue, a change in color. So the expression of yellow-green within a shadow is not actually the same expression of it in the light, except darker. It's actually far more brown because of that yellow. So when you darken yellow, you actually kind of wind up using a brown, like an umber or something, actually to create that darker value. If you've ever painted sunflowers, for instance, this will be something that's pretty familiar to you. So as we transition towards that shadow, it's not just a dark green. Actually, because of the proportion of yellow within this local color, we're actually changing it to something that's a little bit more brown. So that's where I'm going to start. Maybe I'll take a little bit of my ultramarine blue, and I'm just going to cool this off a little bit. I think I probably went a little bit too far towards a kind of a neutral brown. Starting out also, something you should know, and this is a lot of preamble just for painting, but the value scale that's present here is actually not kind of black and white. If you really took a look at like the kind of black value of this pigment here and compared it to this graphite, you'd see this is really quite a light gray in comparison. So we have here like a very limited value scale. And I might even kind of block this in an even more limited value scale, because I'm just trying to deal with, like I said, 5 or 6 local color values. And I want to save my like darkest accents for much later on in the painting, right? Those in a way are going to be some of the last things that I put in, is the kind of lightest light and the darkest dark. Now all these like initial color kind of lay-ins that you're making, these are in a way like a hypothesis, right? They're not things that you're going to get too, I want to say like married to, right? Like you're not going to spend your life with those colors. They're going to be things that are going to change as you go. The next thing I'm going to do is kind of search for a local color value here, which, right, is kind of a light beige-ish color value. So I'm just starting out with white. I'm going to go for yellow-brown, a bit of vermilion. Eventually, right, there's, you know, this is more kind of about temperature than it is about, strictly speaking, about like color, right? Like if you're, you know, looking at the background behind this pear in the source photograph, it's essentially just a warm gray. Now, let's talk about this color value here as well, though, because when we look at our source photograph, and again, I know I sent it to you, probably you're not looking at it now, but it is almost the same value, actually, as the interior of the pear that it's right next to. I would say that probably the interior value of the pear is a little bit lighter than what this is. So I need to choose a color value that, if you kind of took a black and white photograph, would be almost the same, but a tiny bit darker, right? So just a tiny bit darker than what that one is. Now, as I place this one in here, and I squint down and I kind of compare those two, it's not dark enough, actually. It's reading as almost exactly the same value, if not a tiny bit lighter. So I need to darken my color value down here. So I'm going to take a little bit of my pure pigments again. And as I'm adding more of the red and yellow to this, you can see like it's starting to become very chromatic. So I'm going to take a little bit of blue, which is the complementary color to that orange, and I'm just going to kind of gray it down. So remember, we're just going for a kind of warm gray. Now, I mean, we can take, for instance, right, and let's do a little kind of like color, not experiment here, but a demonstration. Let's take a little bit of actual neutral gray. and compare it to this, you can see how cool that gray looks, right? It almost looks like it's like I've used blue to make that in relationship to the warmth here and the overall kind of warmth of the palette. So that's one way that you can kind of look at the grays and the colors that you're mixing up, is what would they be like in relationship to kind of a neutral gray. So we're going to bring the project to a close today. The thing that we want to take away from this process is really the procedure of studying color. The way that we went from very broad assertions and guesses about those colors into a lot more specific examples of how those colors interacted with each other. That timeline that goes from broad to specific, that goes from simple to complex, from obtuse to subtle, this is the trajectory that we want to follow in studying color, and understand that your expression of color in a painting is something that is, in a sense, progressively expressed. So that when we look at, for instance, like the interaction of blues and yellows in this area just around the kind of highlighted plane, that is something I didn't walk into the painting thinking was going to be the case. I had some thoughts that were going to be maybe that was a more kind of neutralized or kind of mixed section, but actually I wasn't able to do that with the palette that I was using. The same thing that I guessed about actually the kind of lighter background around the lower edges of the pear, I considered that probably that would be something that would be maybe 1-2 value steps above what it actually wound up being in order to achieve the kind of effect of light that we kind of worked on up here. The same thing in the background. There was a sense that initially starting out the block, and I thought probably this would stay quite far away from what it is now, which is really nearly almost black. Studying color, we just want to understand that it is a process, that it is a journey, and that it ends in hopefully a very different place than the one that it starts in.